I'm going to be talking about what the public doesn't understand, perhaps what geneticists don't understand about genetics, which is really quite a lot. And if you explain what we can't understand in half an hour, it's almost impossible. Or to explain what we can understand in half an hour would be easy. All right, you've introduced yourself to the person to your left. Can you now look to the person at your left and at your right? Okay, and I can say, I do this with my first year students in their first lecture, I can say with a certain degree of confidence that 2 out of the 3 of you will die for reasons connected to the genes you carry. Now, quite what that means I'll talk about during the next half hour. It's rather more subtle than you think, but if I can cheer you up by saying that I've been giving this lecture in Shakespeare's time, 2 out of 3 of you would be dead already. Okay. And here are the patterns of life and death. Shakespeare's time, 1600 or so, only 1 baby in 3 made it to be 21. 1801, just before Darwin was born, a little bit more than 1 in 2. 2001, 98.9%, probably marginally even better than that now. Okay. So that's quite an astounding progress in social and medical care in that time. But of course, I have news for you, those of you who are not medically qualified. You all die in the end. Okay? Actually, maybe I should have news for you who are medically qualified. Your patients are going to die in the end. And we die, of course, for different reasons. In the old days, we used to die from things that came from outside, from cold, starvation, violence, that kind of stuff. Now we die, to quote a famous phrase, from the enemy within. And by that I mean our inherent weaknesses, which tend to kill us off. There's no question of that. Now, that apparently stark dichotomy is in fact very misleading. Nature and nurture always work together. People perhaps don't realize where the phrase nature and nurture comes from. It is actually from Shakespeare. It's in the Tempest, the sailors land on this island, are shipwrecked on this island, and they find on it this awful little monster called Caliban, who they try to be nice to, and it simply doesn't work. And in great exasperation, one of the characters says, "On thy foul nature, nurture will never stick." And there's a feeling in the public mind, and I have to say in many geneticists' mind, that somehow with modern technology we can separate nature and nurture, gene and environment. In my case, I hope I'll persuade you of, is that that's much harder to do, perhaps even impossible, than many people think. Now, here at UCL, we're given instructions by the provost on the first day of every term that we have to interrupt our lectures every 15 minutes for an advertising break. So here's a UCL advertising break. This is Sir Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's not smarter cousin, who was the founder, effectively in some senses, of human genetics. And he left a large sum of money in 1911 to UCL to found the first human genetics department in the world, and the Galton Chair of Human Genetics. And it's clear that Galton had an enormous 19th century confidence about what he thought he knew, because he wrote a book called Hereditary Genius, in which he pointed out that genius, as it were, tends to run in families. That people whose fathers were judges tend to be judges, people whose fathers were coal miners tended to be coal miners, and so on. And he produced this science, or quasi-science, that was called eugenics, which is an attempt to measure human quality. Now, many people say eugenics has gone. I don't think it's gone at all. Eugenics means being well born, and I think that's part of the task of modern biology, modern medicine, modern genetics. But Galton was interested, as I say, in human quality. He studied it in many different ways, some of which were really quite serious, and some of which perhaps more flippant. He's the only person, as far as we know, to have made a beauty map of the British Isles, and we still have a little brass counting device, which he used to hold in the palm of his hand and go from city to city, scoring the local females on a 5-point scale. From attractive to repulsive. The low point was in Aberdeen, where it still is, and the high point is where it still is in South Kensington, near where Harrods now stands. Okay. Now that sounds like a very strange thing to do, but in fact it wasn't. It was an attempt to measure objectively some human attribute. Beauty is an odd attribute, but intelligence is an attribute one can measure, height, weight, all these things, and in principle we can study their genetics. And it's easy to mock the notion that we could do that, but actually with modern technology it seems at least that we are beginning to do it almost as a routine. If you type in the phrase with Sedil, you say in English, I can't remember, scientists find the gene for into Google, you get about 30,000 hits, which is pretty impressive because we've only got about 24,000 genes. But even so, okay, here are some of them. A gene for emotional memory, divorce, depression, sweet tooth. The bottom one is premature ejaculation. How that one stays in the population, I don't quite understand. And it's fatally easy to say that we have found the gene for this, for that, or for the other. And it's fatally misleading to say it too. Now, Galton was without question a serious scientist. He really was. And this is the first scientific diagram ever published on human genetics. It's Galton's regression of height. Now, Galton invented the word regression, now standard word in statistics. And what he did was something blindingly obvious, but nobody had ever done it before. He measured the heights of fathers and sons, parents and offspring, and he put them on a graph. And he found, indeed, that there was a striking similarity, fit between the two. Height runs in families. And now people kind of knew that before, but of course he was the first person to put that formally. And we now know that the heritability, as we say, of height, and that's the proportion of the total variation which is due to genetic variation, the heritability of height is about 0.7. 70% of the total variation of height within a particular population, in a particular place, at a particular time, is due to genetic variation. And that comes straight out of Galton's work. Well, nobody will deny that there are genes that alter human height. Here's a Velázquez painting of an individual with a chondroplasia, chondroplastic dwarfism it used to be called, with short arms and legs, and we know an awful lot about that particular gene. We know what it does. It's a growth factor which has been damaged. Very often, actually, the new variant is due to a new mutation in the parents, the normal parents who have an affected child. It's not a serious condition really at all. I mean, there were social pressures. I like to think they have gone away, but it shows that there are genetic variants that can have a dramatic effect on human height. On the other end of the scale, here we have Sultan Kuzin, who's the world's tallest man. So if I remember, 8 foot 1 inch tall. Okay, and on his right, we have a skeleton which is in the Royal College of Surgeons in London, which was the Irish giant who showed himself in the 18th century to a curious crowd, died young, was desperate not to be dissected, but of course surgeons being what they are, just stole his body and dissected it and put it in the museum there. And the famous endocrinologist Harvey Cushing in 1902, I think it was, looked at the skeleton and found from the shape of the skull that this individual must have had a pituitary tumor. The pituitary, one of the many things it does is to produce growth hormone, and he produced too much growth hormone and kept growing and growing and growing. And quite remarkably, an Irish family has been found with 14 members who have got this condition. The DNA has been taken out and it's been looked at. We know exactly what the mutation is. And with the joys of technology, people have gone to the skeleton, the Irish giant, taken out DNA from that 250-year-old skeleton or more, and he has exactly the same genetic mutation. So clearly, there is genetic variation in the genes for human height. However, when we begin to use technology to look at the normal range of human height, we've run into a terrible, terrible and quite unexpected problem. Now, we all know, of course, that genetic technology is now utterly remarkable. There's a lot of DNA about. Everybody, if you were to rush out of this lecture paralysed by tedium into Gower Street and to be knocked flat by a speeding number 73 bus, the DNA in your body would stretch to the moon and back 8,000 times. That's a lot of DNA. And at the end of this lecture, every one of you will be a different person from what you were at the beginning, because you will have made several hundred miles of DNA in the next half hour. Men, I have to say, for reasons too sordid to go into in detail, will have made even more, okay? Which is why we look so tired and frazzled all the time. And of course, there are 3,300 million DNA letters, which can now be sequenced with astonishing speed. I never know who to believe. The most recent estimate of the record time for sequencing the whole human genome is now down to 3.5 hours, which is pretty impressive, given that it took 15 years in the first instance. So it seems then that we must be on the edge of a new era, where we can read, as it were, the book of life imprinted in everybody's genes at birth or even before birth, and plot out and see what is going to happen to their medical fate, perhaps even their social and their intellectual fate as the years go on. Well, that might be an interesting or an alarming idea, but it turns out to be quite problematic, because we face this problem which nobody really expected. I wrote this talk about 2 minutes ago, so it's all right. We face this, where are we? We face a problem, which is what I call McCavity genes. We all know McCavity, the mystery cat, terrible crime has been committed, a peak has been strangled, but McCavity is not there. Now, we know with absolute certainty from Galton onwards, on hundreds of thousands of measurements, that a huge proportion of the total variation in human height within a population is due to genetic variation. Nobody disputes that for a moment. But if we search, what happens? We can't find the genes. Now, these are rather complicated diagrams. These lines are different studies on many, many thousands of people on the proportion of the total variation in human height in different populations, and these are different authors on different populations, which are explained by 180 variants tracked across the whole genome, just as kind of milestones placed along the DNA. And we can see that on average, only about 10% or less of the total variation in human height can be tracked to genes that we can find in the human genome. Okay. Now we've gone much further than that. Here's a pretty impressive piece of work done by the Icelandic group. 304,000 DNA variants across the human genome. How many of them have an effect on statistically significant effect on human height? It's again rather hard to pick this up directly from the diagram. I'll talk you through it. That green line you can see is the level of statistical significance you have to attain for the gene or the variant that you found to have any effect on human height. And you can see of the 304,000 in blue there, blue and black there, only about 30 or 40 have a significant effect on human height. So McCavity is not there. We can't find the genes. So that is really quite a difficulty. And it's quite an unexpected difficulty too. Even geneticists are now getting a bit shy of saying scientists find the gene for. And what's happened in the last year or two, and I've been to numbers of talks, 2 years ago or a year ago, I went again and again to talks where people said, we found the gene that predisposes to schizophrenia, coronary heart disease, bipolar disorder, all these things. Now everybody has suddenly gone rather quiet because the situation is much more complex than we thought. But there's a deeper problem, which is actually, what do you mean, even if you did find the gene for human height, what do you actually mean by it? And actually you mean perhaps both less and more than you might think. Human height is heritable, but that doesn't alter the fact that it's also open to the environment. Here's a classic genetic diagram of the young students at the Connecticut Agricultural College in 1914, arranged according to height, and their mean height was 5 foot 7.3 inches in 1914. And there's a nice normal distribution there, with this poor little fellow who's only 4 foot 10. And this giant who's 6 foot 2, most people seem to be 6 foot 2 to me, speaking as a stunted Celt. Here's an they kind of messed this up, but this is 100 and something years later, same place. There's the top, the one you've just seen, and there's the bottom. Now, in these modern days, and I'm all in favour of this, you have to put the women in too. So they put women in black, in white, but it kind of confuses the diagram. So just look at the people dressed in black. They're the males, and you'll see in a century or so, the mean height has gone up from whatever it was, 6.67 inches to 70 inches, which is 3 inches, okay? And that isn't because there's been a lot of evolution in that time, or natural selection for height. It's because people eat better. And yeah, I see that in my own lifetime. When I was a lad, when I was young, I lived in Wales, and I always reminded myself of a line from Dylan Thomas, which he describes himself. Dylan Thomas says, describing himself, he was of normal height for Wales, that is, and so was I. I'm 5 foot 7, but I'm now on the average 2.5 inches shorter than the average UCL undergraduate. And that's exactly the same thing. So height is absolutely open to the environment. Nature and nurture are working together. So let's talk that through. Even if we could find genes, what would that tell us, if anything, about their importance, relative indeed to the environment? There's a huge amount of genetics that's done on this experimental animal, which is the cat. And my students roll their eyes when I give them yet another cat example. I'll only give you one here. This is the classic example of nature and nurture working together. Okay. Now, the Siamese cat is a mutation. It's called the Himalayan mutation, and we all know what it is: black nose, ears, and tails. If it's a gentleman cat, which this one is, albeit a rather shy gentleman cat, black testicles too, and a white body mass. It's present in many, many mammals, not, unfortunately, really, not in humans. It'd be rather a charming mutation to have in humans, but we don't have it. And you can do genetics, and indeed, we know exactly what it does. It works in one particular biochemical pathway called the melanin pathway. We know what the error is. We know precisely what's gone wrong. Okay. So it's a genetic disease, if you want to call it a disease. Interestingly, and rather in brackets, an awful lot of mouse coat color mutations do manifest themselves as human genetic diseases, but that's a different story. So that's the Siamese cat. So it's genetic. Now, many Siamese breeders like dark or light-colored cats, and what they do is they breed for many generations from a dark one or a light one, and they can slowly change the appearance of their cat. But actually, this mutation is odd, because its effects depend on the environment in which it's placed. What it's done is damage an enzyme, but damage it only slightly. And you all know that if you want to dissolve sugar in water or in tea, it's much easier to do it in hot water than cold water, because, to use the technical language, there are more molecules zizzing about, and they dissolve the sugar. And what that means here is that the cool parts of the cat's body, which are noticeably cooler, 2 or 3 degrees Celsius, than the main body mass, then the enzyme can work. So on the nose, the ears, the tail, and the testicles, which of course are both metaphorically and actually the coolest part of any male body, you get black pigment being formed, and on the body mass you don't. And if you want to change the color of this genetic mutation, if you want, for example, to make it dark, keep it in a cold room, all right? And that's the cat in a cold room. If you really want to make a stir, keep your Siamese in a refrigerator, and you'll have a black cat. Inside it will be a Siamese struggling to get out. And you can keep it in a warm room, and you get a cat that looks like that. There's a famous experiment done by somebody with a cat called Edward, who shaved the initial on its side, kept it cool, and grew a letter E in perfectly natural black fur. Okay. So is it genetic or is it environmental? It's both. Okay. It means nothing whatsoever to think that it's to say that this is the gene for Siamese or this is the environment for Siamese. They work together. People often think of the phenotype, the human appearance, as being like a cake. A cake you can slice into a bit called nature and a bit called nurture. You can't do it. You have to unbake the cake. What happens if indeed you eat a cake, or should I say, too many cakes? Well, what happens is you get fat. And there is, as everybody will know, perhaps as people don't realize the gravity of the situation, there is an epidemic, a genuine epidemic of obesity spreading at great speed across the world. In about 1971, a gigantic tsunami of lard began to wash across the Atlantic and break upon British shores. And we now have the proud boast that we are the fattest country in Western Europe. But compared to the United States, that's nothing, all right? Now, if you've been there recently, you will see, you know exactly what I mean. And you might say, quite reasonably, that that's a genetic phenomenon, that's an environmental phenomenon. The price of food has dropped, as we'll see, and there's been a massive, massive increase in obesity. And the figures are really quite startling. That's the only word for it. This is the proportion of obese individuals in the United States from 1985 to today. And I'll run through it very quickly. Cool colors. White, coolest of all, pale blue and blue. Low proportions, less than 10% is in dark blue here. And as we go on from year to year, 1990, 1993, 94, 95, 6, 8, 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. Now that's a pretty damned impressive. That's a pretty damned impressive and depressing change. We're at a situation now that in many parts of the US, more than 1 person in 3 is clinically obese. And I read just the other day in the journal Science that 1 US teenager in 3 shows signs of adult onset diabetes. And adult onset diabetes, early signs. Adult onset diabetes is not something you want to have, that's for sure. Okay. So you might say, and you'd be right to say, that this is due absolutely to an environmental change. What's the environmental change? Let me just point out that we ourselves have nothing to be proud about. This is the UK fat map. All right? It's utterly predictable. The poor parts of the country are obese. The richer parts of the country are less obese. I'm Welsh and we're fat. I'm not fat, but plenty of Welsh people actually are, because Welsh people generally tend to be rather poor. And we live in an extraordinary moment in human history, which is for the first time, the poor are fat and the rich are thin. That's a complete reversal of what's happened in historical times. Okay? So it's a big problem, and you might argue that it's entirely environmental. It is indeed, no doubt, due to a great extent to a change in the price of food. If you were to go back to 1920 or so, the average American man would have to work 24 hours a week in order just to get enough food to feed himself, his wife, and 2 children. Now that's down to about 2 hours a week. So basically food, at least junk food, soft drinks most of all, have effectively become free. People have succumbed to this environmental change and have become fat. However, genes are involved too. Of course, fat runs in families. Here we have a typical American family, or an almost typical American family, a morbidly obese parents and a daughter who clearly is pretty damned obese herself. So you might say, well, okay, maybe this is in fact, it could be genetic indeed. Here on the other hand is a picture of their cat. And it's a little known scientific fact, which is in fact true, that fat people tend to have fat pets. Fat cats, fat dogs, fat goldfish, not because they, I hope they don't, not because they share genes with them, but because they overfeed the pets in the way that they overfeed themselves. So you might say, all right, well, all this obesity stuff is environmental, but it's not. Because, as many of you will know, there are certainly genes which alter patterns of human body mass, just in the same way as they alter human height. There are abnormalities in the DNA which often have a striking effect. And that's something we find very generally in genetics, is that rare things are easy to study, but the abnormal is not usually the key to the normal. So that the patterns of obesity you see in the general population do not have much relevance to the clinical patterns of obesity, which are caused by now quite well-known genetic mutations. The most famous one was found in this mouse. We've seen a fat cat. Let's look at a fat mouse. That's a mouse which turned up in the laboratory stain about 15, 20 years ago now, called the obese mouse. And if you give this mouse a good life, and I can tell you lab animals have a very good life compared to in the wild, it will eat and eat and eat until it'll get grossly obese. And if you do genetics, it turns out that it's a genetic mutation which you know an enormous amount about, which means indeed that it has lost the sense of satiety. We all know, of course, that when we feel hungry, what we don't realize is that there is a countermanding emotion, which is that when you've eaten enough, you put your knife and fork down. This mouse doesn't know when to put his knife and fork down, okay? Now, it's a protein hormone called leptin, which it works in the brain, and it's present very rarely in humans. Here we have a child born with leptin deficiency, and this poor infant felt it was starving at all times. And under those circumstances, it's extremely difficult, of course, for any parent to deny their baby the food it needs, because the baby perceives itself to be starving to death of hunger. Of course, it isn't. And of course, not of course, but marvelously, this can be treated with almost complete success by replacing the missing hormone, leptin, and you can see in that boy, after treatment, he's almost down to normal body mass. So you might say, okay, it's genetic. But the abnormal is not the key to the normal. Leptin works mainly in the brain. Strangely enough, actually, when I say abnormal is not the key to the normal, it turns out there are lots and lots of variants like this. Leptin is just one. Leptin is a rare, very rare, 1 in 10,000 births or so. But there are so many major appetite and metabolic mutations which are individually rare that together they might actually explain quite a bit of the mass of obesity that we see in the population as a whole. When I say quite a bit, I mean I think 4 or 5%, much more than anybody might have thought. But of course, I don't think they're relevant to the individuals in the other 96%. But ironically enough, when people began to look for genetics in the etiology and the cause in the control of obesity in the general population. To everybody's surprise, what happened was not the same as what's happened with height, which has been a complete bust. Oddly enough, one gene, at least one gene, has come to the fore. Here we have what's called a Manhattan plot. For those of you who don't know, what a Manhattan plot is sort of presentation of the effects of different genes on different chromosomes on the attribute, in this case of body mass, which you're looking at. At the bottom there we've got the chromosome numbers 1 through 21 and 22, okay? And they were called Manhattan plots when they started, and they started about 10 years ago, I guess, because the hope was that if you looked at any human attribute, psychiatric disorders or high blood pressure, it would look like the skyline of Manhattan. You would have skyscrapers popping up now and again, which would tell you where the genes involved might be found. Well, strangely enough, that hasn't happened. If you look at most Manhattan plots, they look more like I don't know, a nice logo, more like New Delhi plots, except New Delhi's got plenty of skyscrapers in. They're generally flat. There's nothing in there. Obesity, very strangely, and by astonishingly good luck, turns out that there is at least one gene that has an effect on body mass for almost everybody. It's called FTO. You see that great tall skyscraper there on chromosome 16. So let's look at FTO a little bit more. And it illustrates another unexpected issue in genetics, totally unexpected, which is that genes that do something in one creature can do something quite different in humans. Now here's a mouse with a genetic mutation, okay? Its mutation is it's only got 3 fingers or 4 fingers on each hand, all right? If you look carefully. Now he's a bit shy about his feet, but I think knowing what we do about development, he's probably got missing toes as well, okay? What's going on? He's actually obviously got the mouse FTO mutant because FTO stands for fused toes. If you take mice with this mutant, their toes fuse together so they don't have, if they've got one copy of the mutant, if you've got 2 copies, it's lethal, and they have this skeletal abnormality. And it was completely startling to discover that that same gene in humans, FTO, influences body mass. And here's the here are the data. There are, as I said, there are many thousands of millions of DNA letters in the code, the human code, but at one particular point, and that's the letter number 9939609. About 1 in 4 of the population has 2 copies of the letter T, about 1 in 4 of the population has 2 copies of the letter A, and about half the population have one of each. And if you look at the genotype, which is very easy to do, you could do it in a few minutes, you find that those who've got 2 copies of the letter A, on the average, weigh 2.5 kilograms more, that's 6 or 7 pounds more, than those who've got 2 copies of the letter T. And if you look at their behavior, it's because they have a bigger appetite. When babies are born with these different genotypes, they weigh exactly the same, one to the other, but they put on 2 or 3 pounds weight within 6 months. So they feel hungrier than other people do. Okay? So you might say, possibly, that this is actually a genetic phenomenon. But of course it isn't. If food was still so expensive you couldn't afford to buy enough, this genotype would be utterly irrelevant. It wouldn't matter because nobody could go out there and stuff themselves with 6 McDonald's hamburgers because they couldn't afford to do it. So nature and nurture are working as they always do. Skip the next one here. And what's interesting is that as geneticists have begun to look at more and more human clinical conditions, it turns out that it's actually rather rare to find a clinical condition which has a discoverable genetic component. Some certainly do. Macular degeneration, which is a blindness, probably half the variation is due to genetic variation. But when you go down to the bottom there, height 5%, that's rather optimistic. Early onset myocardial heart attacks, we're down to 2-3%. Glucose levels, very important in predisposition to diabetes, down to 1.5%. Type 2 diabetes, relatively heritable, only 6% of the total variation due to genetic variation. So actually what we've learned in genetics is something almost unknown to scientists, which is humility. People no longer say, at least I hope they don't say, we have found the gene for X. Or to put it another way, biology, genetics can tell you everything you need to know about yourself apart from the interesting stuff. And what genetics actually does, if you're a geneticist now, what you realize is that what really matters is the environment you live in. I'll stop there. Thank you.